Oscar sends a warning to Norris and McLaren after unfair treatment. Fernando gets salty after Lewis's brake failure. And George dominates Singapore. Let's get into the latest F1 news. What happens when teammates become title rivals and racing gets messy? The Singapore Grand Prix just gave us a masterclass in Formula One drama, and trust me, you're going to want to hear about this explosive clash between McLaren's Golden Boys. Picture this. Lights out at Marina Bay, damp track conditions, and Lando Norris launching his Papaya rocket from 5th place straight into controversy. Within seconds of the race start, we witnessed what might become the defining moment of McLaren's championship campaign. But here's where it gets spicy. Norris didn't just battle random competitors. He went wheel to wheel with his own teammate, Oscar Piastri, in a move that's got the entire Formula One paddock talking. The drama unfolded faster than you could blink. Norris, starting from 5th after a disappointing qualifying session, spotted a gap on the inside and went for it with the kind of aggression that separates champions from also-rans. But the Singapore street circuit had other plans. The track surface, still treacherous from earlier rain, turned what should have been a clean overtake into a pinball sequence of contact. First, Norris clipped Max Verstappen's Red Bull. That contact sent the British driver careening into his teammate Piastri, who was running a comfortable 3rd place. Within moments, Piastri found himself sliding toward the barriers, his race compromised before they'd even completed the first corner. The radio crackled with frustration as Piastri's voice cut through the team communications. That wasn't very team-like. Not fair. Now here's where this story gets really interesting. Instead of apologizing or showing remorse, Norris came out swinging in defense of his move. Speaking to media after securing 3rd place, the championship contender delivered what can only be described as a masterclass in defiant confidence. He argued that any driver who wouldn't have gone for that same gap shouldn't be racing in Formula One at all. Think about the psychology here for a moment. Norris is currently trailing Piastri by 22 points in what's shaping up to be one of the most intense teammate rivalries in recent memory. Every point matters, every position counts, and every opportunity to gain ground becomes precious. From Norris's perspective, that inside gap represented more than just track position. It was potentially his only chance to make moves on a circuit notorious for processional racing. The British driver's explanation reveals the calculated risk-taking that defines elite motorsport. He acknowledged hitting Verstappen first, which caused the subsequent contact with Piastri, but maintained that the initial move was entirely justified. In his words, the slippery conditions and close quarters made contact almost inevitable, but the alternative, sitting behind and accepting 5th place, would have been championship suicide. What makes this controversy even more fascinating is McLaren's famous Papaya Rules philosophy. The team has built its reputation this season on allowing both drivers to race freely while expecting clean, fair competition. But what happens when championship pressure meets split-second decision-making on a damp street circuit? Suddenly, those clean racing ideals get tested in the most brutal way possible. Piastri's frustration is completely understandable. Imagine starting 3rd, running in a podium position, only to get shuffled back by your own teammate's ambitious move. The Australian driver nearly kissed the barriers and dropped to 4th, where he would eventually finish despite a strong recovery drive in the closing stages. His radio message captured the raw emotion of a competitor who felt wronged by someone wearing the same team colors. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming. McLaren team principal Andrea Stella chose not to intervene during the race. No team orders, no position swaps, no immediate consequences for the contact. This decision speaks volumes about how the team views their championship battle. They're willing to let their drivers race each other, even when it gets messy, even when feelings get hurt. The mathematics of this championship fight add another layer of intrigue. With Norris needing to outscore Piastri by an average of 3.7 points per weekend over the remaining 6 races, every single position becomes critical. 3 of those remaining weekends feature sprint races, offering additional opportunities to score points and potentially swing momentum. From a strategic standpoint, Norris's aggressive approach makes perfect sense. Singapore's Marina Bay circuit is notoriously difficult for overtaking, with narrow streets and limited opportunities to make moves. If you don't capitalize on the chaos of lap 1, you might spend the entire race stuck behind slower cars, watching precious championship points slip away. The steward's decision not to penalize Norris adds credibility to his version of events. Professional race officials, with access to multiple camera angles and telemetry data, deemed the incident a racing incident rather than reckless driving. This official vindication strengthens Norris's argument that he did nothing wrong beyond slightly misjudging his proximity to Verstappen's car. What's particularly striking about Norris's post-race comments is his unapologetic stance. Rather than diplomatic damage control, he doubled down on his decision-making process. He argued that reviewing the incident might reveal minor adjustments he could make, but fundamentally, he stands by the split-second judgment that gained him 2 positions when overtaking opportunities were virtually non-existent. The ripple effects of this incident extend far beyond Singapore. With 6 races remaining and a 22-point gap to close, every interaction between these teammates carries championship implications. The trust between them, the team's management of their rivalry, and their ability to race hard while avoiding further contact will determine who emerges as McLaren's champion. This Singapore controversy perfectly encapsulates modern Formula One's psychological warfare. Championships aren't just won through pure speed anymore. They require mental resilience, political navigation, and the courage to make split-second decisions under immense pressure. Norris demonstrated all 3 qualities in those opening moments at Marina Bay, whether you agree with his methods or not. Did you know that sometimes the biggest Formula One drama happens after the checkered flag drops? What unfolded between Lewis Hamilton and Fernando Alonso after the Singapore Grand Prix proves that emotions in racing can boil over in ways that leave fans absolutely stunned. Today we're diving into one of the most explosive radio rants in recent Formula One history, and trust me, this story has everything. Brake failures, steward investigations, and words that would make your grandmother blush. Picture this. You're Fernando Alonso, one of the most respected drivers on the grid, and you've just watched what you believe is an unfair situation play out right in front of your eyes. The race is over, you've crossed the line in 8th place, and suddenly your team radio becomes the outlet for pure, unfiltered rage. This is exactly what happened in Singapore, and the aftermath reveals so much about the intense psychology of Formula One racing. Let me set the scene for you. During the Singapore Grand Prix, Lewis Hamilton found himself in 7th place, seemingly comfortable in his Ferrari. But as racing teaches us time and time again, nothing is ever guaranteed until that final corner. A brake issue struck both Ferrari cars in the closing stages, and suddenly Hamilton's position became precarious. Behind him, Fernando Alonso in his Aston Martin sensed opportunity like a shark smelling blood in the water. The final lap became a desperate defensive drive for Hamilton. With compromised brakes, he was fighting to maintain 7th position while Alonso closed in rapidly. Hamilton managed to cross the finish line just 0.4 of a second ahead of the charging Spaniard. On paper, it looked like Hamilton had pulled off a masterful defensive drive under pressure. But the stewards had other ideas. Here's where the story takes a dramatic turn. The race officials launched a post-race investigation, examining Hamilton's driving in those crucial final moments. They were particularly focused on whether Hamilton had left the track without justifiable reason during his defensive maneuvers. After reviewing the evidence, the stewards reached a verdict that would ignite Alonso's fury. Hamilton had indeed exceeded track limits multiple times and would receive a 5-second time penalty. This penalty was enough to drop Hamilton behind Alonso in the final classification, moving the Aston Martin driver up to 7th place. But by this time, Alonso had already heard enough to trigger what would become one of the most memorable radio transmissions of the season. When Alonso keyed his radio after the race, the words that poured out were raw with emotion and disbelief. He expressed his complete incredulity at what he had witnessed, using language that the broadcast censors definitely had to work around. The Spanish driver was particularly incensed about what he saw as inconsistent application of safety regulations. Alonso's anger wasn't just about this single incident. He referenced a previous investigation involving Hamilton from practice sessions, suggesting a pattern of lenient treatment. In his view, driving a car with brake problems represented a safety hazard that should have resulted in immediate action, not a post-race penalty discussion. The psychological aspect of this outburst reveals something fascinating about elite competitors. Alonso wasn't just angry about losing a position. He was frustrated with what he perceived as unfair treatment and inconsistent rule enforcement. His radio message included pointed questions about safety standards, asking how it could be acceptable to continue racing with compromised brakes when he had previously faced scrutiny for much smaller infractions. What makes this situation even more compelling is the respect these two drivers have for each other historically. Hamilton and Alonso are both multiple world champions who have shared teams and battled wheel to wheel for years. This wasn't a rookie complaining about a veteran. This was one legend calling out another, which adds significant weight to the controversy. The stewards ultimately agreed with Alonso's assessment, at least regarding the track limits violations. The 5-second penalty stood, vindicating Alonso's immediate post-race prediction that Hamilton deserved punishment for his actions. This agreement between Alonso's heat-of-the-moment assessment and the officials' measured deliberation shows just how well these drivers understand the sport's regulations. From a strategic perspective, this incident highlights the razor-thin margins that define modern Formula One. Hamilton's brake issues created a genuine safety concern, but also put him in an impossible position. Slow down too much and lose positions, push too hard and risk penalties, or worse. It's these impossible choices that separate good drivers from great ones. The aftermath of this radio explosion also demonstrates how modern Formula One operates. Every word spoken on team radio can become public, turning private moments of frustration into viral content. Drivers must navigate not just the physical challenges of racing, but also the reality that their emotional responses become part of their public narrative. This Singapore Grand Prix incident will likely be remembered not just for the racing action, but for the raw human emotion it revealed. Alonso's radio rant stripped away the usual diplomatic language of post-race interviews, giving fans a genuine glimpse into the intensity that drives these elite competitors. Sometimes the most memorable moments in Formula One happen not during the race itself, but in those explosive seconds immediately afterward when emotions run highest and filters come down completely. What happens when two teammates clash on the opening lap of a Formula One race and one driver believes they've been wronged? The Singapore Grand Prix just delivered a perfect example of team politics, racing incidents, and the delicate balance between competition and collaboration within McLaren's championship-winning squad. Picture this: you're Oscar Piastri, sitting in second place on the grid behind your teammate Lando Norris. The lights go out, and within seconds, you find yourself behind him after what you consider an unfair move. Your immediate reaction? Get on the radio and demand justice. But what happens when your team says no? This exact scenario unfolded at Marina Bay, creating one of the most fascinating team dynamics we've seen all season. The incident occurred at Turn 3 when Norris made contact with Max Verstappen ahead of him, causing him to oversteer directly into Piastri's path. The resulting wheel-to-wheel contact left Piastri feeling like he'd been bulldozed out of position by his own teammate. The Australian's frustration was immediate and visceral. Over the team radio, he questioned whether McLaren was comfortable with Norris essentially barging past him, describing the move as anything but team-like behavior. His anger was understandable given the context of their season-long battle for supremacy within the McLaren garage. What makes this situation particularly intriguing is the recent history between these two drivers. Just weeks earlier at Monza, Piastri had graciously moved aside to allow Norris through after a slow pit stop compromised the Briton's race. That act of team solidarity created an expectation of reciprocity, making McLaren's refusal to intervene in Singapore even more controversial. Team principal Andrea Stella found himself in an impossible position. On one hand, he had a clearly frustrated driver who felt wronged by his teammate. On the other, he had to evaluate whether the incident warranted team intervention. Stella's explanation reveals the complex decision-making process that happens in real time during a Grand Prix. The key factor in McLaren's decision was the chain of events leading to the contact. Norris hadn't deliberately moved into Piastri's path. Instead, his contact with Verstappen had caused him to lose control momentarily, creating the collision with his teammate. This distinction between intentional and accidental contact became crucial in the team's assessment. Stella emphasized that the contact wasn't an isolated incident, but rather a consequence of the racing situation between Norris and Verstappen. This perspective allowed McLaren to justify their decision not to swap the drivers back, treating it as a racing incident rather than an unfair overtake that required correction. The immediate aftermath revealed contrasting approaches from both drivers. While Piastri continued to voice his displeasure over the radio, describing the situation as unfair, Norris maintained his position without apparent concern for his teammates' feelings. This dynamic exposed the competitive tension that exists even within successful partnerships. Piastri's race was further complicated by a slow pit stop that cost him several seconds, ultimately relegating him to 4th place, while Norris claimed the final podium spot. The points gap between them in the championship fight narrowed as a result, adding another layer of frustration for the Australian. What's fascinating about this incident is how it challenges the concept of team orders and fairness in Formula One. When should a team intervene to correct what one driver perceives as an injustice? How do you balance competitive racing with team harmony? These questions become even more complex when both drivers are fighting for the same championship. McLaren's handling of the situation reflects a broader philosophy about allowing their drivers to race each other. By refusing to immediately swap them back, they sent a message that racing incidents would be treated as part of the sport, even when they occur between teammates. This approach requires careful management to prevent long-term damage to team dynamics. The psychological impact on both drivers cannot be understated. Piastri felt betrayed, not just by the incident itself, but by his team's refusal to address what he saw as clear unfairness. Meanwhile, Norris benefited from a favorable decision that could influence how aggressive he might be in future teammate battles. Stella promised a thorough review of the incident, similar to discussions the team held after previous controversies. These internal conversations are crucial for maintaining long-term harmony while establishing clear expectations for future racing situations. The team's ability to learn and grow from these moments often determines their success in managing dual championship campaigns. The Singapore incident also highlights the pressure cooker environment of Formula One racing. Drivers must make split-second decisions while traveling at incredible speeds, then live with the consequences of those choices. What appears clear-cut from the outside can be incredibly complex when viewed from the cockpit during the heat of battle. Moving forward, this incident will likely influence how McLaren manages similar situations. The team must balance their drivers' competitive instincts with the need to maximize points in both championships. Their decision in Singapore may have preserved the natural racing element they value, but it also created tension that needs careful handling. The broader implications extend beyond McLaren's internal dynamics. This incident serves as a case study for how teams should handle controversial moments between their drivers, especially when championship positions are at stake. Lewis Hamilton just got slapped with a penalty that's got the entire Formula One world talking, and honestly, this whole situation reveals something much bigger about how racing rules work in the modern era. What happened in Singapore could change how we think about driver penalties forever. Picture this: you're Lewis Hamilton, 7-time world champion, racing through the streets of Singapore in your Ferrari. Your brakes start failing in the closing stages of the race, and suddenly you're faced with an impossible choice. Do you risk a massive crash by staying within track limits, or do you go wide to manage the mechanical failure and potentially face a penalty? Hamilton chose safety, but the stewards had other ideas. The drama unfolded during the final laps of the Singapore Grand Prix, when Hamilton began experiencing brake power issues. As any experienced driver would do, he started managing the situation by taking wider lines through certain corners. This meant leaving the track at several points during laps 60 and 61, which immediately caught the attention of race officials. Now here's where things get interesting. Hamilton's race engineer, Riccardo Adami, delivered the news over team radio that they'd received a 5-second penalty for track limits violations. Hamilton's response was immediate and telling, "Surely it's not a penalty when it's force majeure?" This phrase, meaning circumstances beyond one's control, perfectly captures the heart of this controversy. The steward's investigation revealed fascinating details about how these decisions are made. During the hearing, Hamilton openly admitted to leaving the track multiple times, explaining that he was actively managing a brake issue. You'd think this would be considered a justifiable reason under the regulations, right? Well, that's where Formula One's rulebook gets complicated. Article 33.3 of the sporting regulations states that drivers must make every reasonable effort to stay on track and cannot leave without justifiable reason. The key word here is justifiable, and apparently managing brake failure doesn't qualify according to the steward's interpretation. They determined that Hamilton's mechanical issues weren't severe enough to warrant the exemption, despite the obvious safety implications. What makes this penalty particularly controversial is the precedent it sets. We're essentially telling drivers that even when facing mechanical failures, they must prioritize staying within white lines over their own safety and that of other competitors. This creates a dangerous precedent where drivers might feel pressured to take unnecessary risks rather than face penalties. The immediate consequence was Hamilton dropping from 7th to 8th place in the final classification. While one position might not seem significant, every point matters in Formula One, especially when championship battles are tight. But the broader implications extend far beyond a single race result. This incident highlights a fundamental problem with how modern Formula One interprets its own regulations. The rules were designed to prevent drivers from gaining unfair advantages by cutting corners or extending track limits. However, they're being applied inflexibly to situations where safety should take precedence over strict adherence to track boundaries. Consider the alternatives Hamilton faced in that moment. He could have maintained his position on track, risking brake failure and a potential high-speed collision with barrier walls. The Singapore circuit is notoriously unforgiving, with concrete walls lining most of the track. A brake failure at racing speeds could have resulted in a catastrophic accident, potentially involving other drivers. The stewards acknowledged Hamilton's explanation, but still concluded that his actions weren't justified under current guidelines. This decision raises serious questions about how we balance competitive fairness with driver safety. Are we creating an environment where drivers feel compelled to take dangerous risks to avoid penalties? What's particularly frustrating is that Hamilton and Ferrari didn't even contest the penalty. They accepted the stewards' decision, suggesting they understood the inflexibility of the current system. This passive acceptance might indicate that teams have resigned themselves to these types of decisions, even when they seem to contradict basic safety principles. The Singapore penalty also occurred during a weekend where Hamilton faced multiple investigations. Earlier, he'd been summoned for an alleged red flag violation during practice, showing how scrutinized every action becomes under the current regulatory framework. This level of micromanagement might be stifling the natural instincts that make great drivers exceptional. Looking at the bigger picture, this incident reflects Formula One's ongoing struggle with consistency in penalty application. Fans and drivers alike have long criticized the seemingly arbitrary nature of steward decisions. One weekend, similar actions might be overlooked, while the next weekend they result in time penalties or worse. The sport needs to seriously reconsider how it handles situations where mechanical failures force drivers into difficult positions. Perhaps there should be clearer guidelines about what constitutes acceptable track limit violations during equipment failures. Maybe teams should be required to provide telemetry data proving mechanical issues before penalties are assessed. This Hamilton penalty isn't just about one driver or one race. It represents a crossroads for Formula One's approach to regulation enforcement. Do we prioritize absolute adherence to track limits, or do we allow reasonable discretion when safety factors come into play? The answer will shape how drivers approach similar situations in the future and ultimately determine whether common sense prevails over rigid rule interpretation. The Singapore Grand Prix penalty has sparked a conversation that Formula One desperately needs to have about balancing competitive integrity with practical safety considerations. What just happened at the Singapore Grand Prix was absolutely wild, and I need to break down every single detail because this race might have just changed everything in the championship fight. The drama, the tension, the controversial moves, close, it all unfolded in spectacular fashion under the Marina Bay lights. Let me start with the moment that has everyone talking. Lando Norris starting from 5th position with his championship rival Max Verstappen 2 spots ahead seemed like a disaster waiting to happen. Singapore is notoriously difficult for overtaking, so track position is absolutely crucial. But here's where it gets interesting. Norris has historically struggled with race starts, especially last season and several times this year. This time, though, he delivered exactly when the pressure was at its maximum. The telemetry data reveals something fascinating about what happened at the start. Norris got an incredible launch, while Kimi Antonelli ahead of him struggled with what appears to be suboptimal tire temperatures. This is critical in Singapore, because getting those tires into the perfect operating window during the formation lap can make or break your entire race. By turn 1, Norris was already completely alongside Antonelli and setting his sights on his teammate Oscar Piastri. Now here's where the controversy begins. Piastri didn't get the ideal line through the first two corners, which left both McLaren drivers running side by side into turn 3. The crucial advantage went to Norris because he had the inside line, and in wheel-to-wheel racing, that's often the deciding factor. Then came the contact that everyone's been analyzing frame by frame. The telemetry reveals the truth about what really happened. Norris was carrying significantly more speed into turn 3 than Verstappen, who had braked much earlier. This put Norris in an impossible position. Every Nagan, he had Verstappen directly in front of him and was forced to either completely alter his racing line or brake hard to avoid contact with the Red Bull. The data shows Norris had to change direction at the very last moment, which inevitably led to contact with Piastri. The stewards quickly ruled this a racing incident, which means no penalties were handed out. But McLaren's decision not to intervene has sparked massive debate. Piastri was furious, believing he deserved to have his third-place position returned to him. This is where McLaren's internal politics get really complicated. We've seen this pattern before. With McLaren, the driver ahead on track typically gets strategic priority. It's a logical approach, but it creates tension when teammates are fighting for positions. In this case, Norris built up a comfortable gap of over 4 seconds while Piastri was left to deal with the aftermath of their collision. The pit stop phase brought even more drama. Just like in Monza earlier this season, McLaren initially asked Norris if Piastri could pit first to cover potential threats from behind. Norris initially agreed, but then immediately changed his mind, deciding he should stop first instead. This shows how much pressure he's feeling in the championship fight. Every strategic decision matters when you're trying to close a points gap. Then disaster struck during the pit stops. McLaren made a mistake on Piastri's left rear tire change, extending his stop by approximately 3 to 3.5 seconds. Combined with the extra time Norris gained on fresh tires, this ballooned the gap between the teammates to nearly 10 seconds. At that moment, Piastri's chance to fight for the podium essentially evaporated. But here's where Max Verstappen inadvertently became a factor in this McLaren drama. On lap 35, the championship leader made an uncharacteristic mistake that cost him around 2 seconds. This error brought Norris back into contention and kept him as a genuine threat until the checkered flag. Verstappen was struggling with brake balance issues and downshift problems throughout the race, which severely impacted his pace. The telemetry from the second half shows just how much pace Piastri had. Despite the pit stop disaster, he was consistently faster than both Norris and Verstappen, posting lap times that were on average a quarter second quicker than Norris and over 0.3 faster than Verstappen. This performance highlights what could have been. Template, without that pit stop error, Piastri would almost certainly have been fighting for second place in the closing stages. What makes this situation even more intriguing is that Verstappen's ongoing car problems meant the final result could have looked completely different. Imagine 3 drivers battling for the podium positions with Verstappen struggling with his machinery. It would have been absolute chaos and potentially gifted Norris even more championship points. The ramifications of this race extend far beyond just one Sunday in Singapore. McLaren has already secured the Constructors' Championship, which changes the dynamic significantly. The question now is whether their approach to driver management will shift, and more importantly, how this incident affects the relationship between their 2 drivers moving forward. With a 22-point gap and 6 races remaining in the championship, every single point matters. Norris managed to reduce his deficit to Verstappen, but the way it happened, variatio, through contact with his own teammate, adds another layer of complexity to an already tense situation. The comparison to the Monza incident is inevitable, though the circumstances were different. In Italy, it was Piastri who benefited from team strategy, while this time the roles were reversed. This pattern of internal McLaren drama is becoming a recurring theme that could ultimately decide not just individual race results, but potentially the championship itself. Looking ahead, this race might mark the end of McLaren's famous Papaya Rules, their supposedly friendly approach to internal competition. When championship points are on the line and tensions are running this high, those gentlemen's agreements often crumble under pressure. The Singapore Grand Prix has essentially set up a fascinating final stretch to the season. Will McLaren continue to let their drivers race freely, or will they start favoring Norris in his championship fight? How will Piastri respond to what he clearly sees as unfair treatment? And can Verstappen overcome his car's current struggles to maintain his championship lead? This race proved that in Formula One, drama doesn't just come from wheel-to-wheel battles with rivals, that is BMX. Sometimes the most explosive moments happen between teammates fighting for the same piece of track.